There's a moment every underdog story needs, the one where the crowd realizes they're not just watching a nice story anymore, they're watching history. And for Alex Eala, that moment came on a grass court in London when her name went up on the draw sheet with a number next to it that no Filipino tennis player had ever worn at a Grand Slam, seed number 29. And to understand why that single digit mattered so much, you have to go back further than Wimbledon. You have to go back to a kid from Quezon City who signed her first endorsement deal when she was 8 years old, before she'd won a single professional match, before anyone outside her family had any real reason to believe in her beyond the fact that she clearly loved the game more than most kids love anything. And that's really where this whole story starts, with a girl whose mother had once stood on a podium herself, a bronze medalist swimmer at the Southeast Asian Games back in 1985, and whose father built a career in business, two parents who understood discipline and sacrifice long before their daughter ever picked up a racket. And somewhere along the way those two parents met while working at the same bank, the Bank of the Philippine Islands, a detail that seems like a footnote until you realize how much weight it would carry years later, because long before BPI ever signed Alex as an ambassador, it was already woven into her family's history, quietly, the way these things often are, sitting there waiting for the story to catch up to it, and catch up it did, because by the time she was a teenager Alex wasn't just promising anymore, she was making headlines, training overseas, grinding through the lonely circuit of junior tournaments where there are no cameras and no crowds, just hotel rooms and practice courts and the kind of repetition that breaks most kids before it makes them. And in 2020 she cracked the world's top 2 in junior rankings. And then in 2022 she did something no Filipino had ever done. She won a junior Grand Slam singles title at the US Open, beating a Czech opponent in the final and turning a name that casual fans barely recognized into a name the entire country suddenly wanted to learn how to pronounce correctly. And it was right around this time, watching a teenager carry herself with that kind of poise, that BPI made its move, signing her as their newest brand ambassador. And when she talked about it publicly, she didn't reach for corporate language, she said. The partnership meant something to her family specifically because her parents had met while working there 3 decades earlier, that it carried what she called sentimental value, and you could tell even then this wasn't going to be one of those relationships where an athlete shows up for a photo shoot once a year and otherwise the brand is just a logo on a hat. This was something that had roots in her actual life before anyone signed a single contract, and for the next few years that relationship grew quietly in the background while Alex did the unglamorous work of climbing the rankings, turning pro, scratching out wins on the ITF Tour in places like Tunisia and Spain and Thailand, the kind of tournaments nobody back home was tuning in for, but that built the foundation a career eventually stands on. And then 2025 arrived and everything changed at once, because ranked outside the top 100, given a wild card into the Miami Open, one of the biggest tournaments on the entire calendar, Alex did something that still sounds slightly unbelievable when you say it out loud. She beat a top 10 player, then she beat a top 5 player, Madison Keys, and suddenly people who had never watched a second of women's tennis were searching her name, and she kept going, taking down Iga Swiatek, one of the most dominant players of her generation, to reach the semifinals, becoming the first Filipino in the Open era to beat both a top 5 and a top 10 opponent, the first Filipino ever to reach a WTA 1000 semifinal, the first Filipino to crack the world's top 100. And if you want to understand what that did for a country that has produced plenty of boxing champions and basketball heroes but almost never a tennis star of this caliber, you only have to look at what happened a few months later when she came home, because in July of 2025, fresh off her Grand Slam debut at Wimbledon, where she pushed former champion Barbara Krejcikova to her absolute limit before falling in 3 sets, Alex flew back to the Philippines for a short visit, and the homecoming wasn't just family dinners and quiet rest. It was BPI executives and directors gathering to celebrate what she'd built, the bank's chairman among them, alongside her own aunt who happens to work in human resources there, a detail that makes the whole partnership feel less like sponsorship and more like an extended family showing up for one of their own. And during that visit Alex stopped by her old school, Colegio San Agustin in Makati, greeted by students who'd grown up watching her become the reason their country suddenly cared about a sport it had mostly ignored. And she left them with a piece of advice that sounds simple until you remember the road she'd walked to earn the right to say it, telling them to dream big, take it step by step, and never underestimate the little things, words that could have come from any motivational poster but landed differently coming from someone who'd spent a decade doing exactly that, one ITF title at a time, one lonely practice session at a time, far from home, far from the comfort of family, chasing something most people around her couldn't fully picture until it actually happened. And from that homecoming the story didn't slow down, it accelerated, because Alex kept playing through the rest of 2025 and into 2026 with a kind of momentum that builds on itself, reaching a career-high ranking, becoming the highest-ranked Filipino in WTA history, becoming the first Filipino to break into the world's top 30, and then arriving at the part of the season tennis people call the grass swing. The few weeks before Wimbledon, where players try to find their rhythm on a surface that rewards a very specific kind of aggression, and it was here, on grass, that Alex found something close to a perfect version of her game, winning a WTA 125 title in Birmingham, then reaching the semi-finals of a WTA 500 event in Berlin, and along the way doing something that made tennis commentators sit up and take notice, beating Elena Rybakina, a former Wimbledon champion, a player whose serve alone has ended careers, and then doing it again days later against another seasoned veteran, back-to-back wins that pushed her ranking up to world number 29, and along with it secured something that had eluded her the year before, an actual seed at Wimbledon. And to put that into context, she became the first Southeast Asian player to earn a seed in singles at a Grand Slam since a Thai player did it all the way back in 2009, which tells you just how rare this kind of run through that part of the world actually is. And when she sat down for an interview after that Berlin semifinal, still processing what had just happened, she said earning a seed touched close to home for her. That Wimbledon specifically carried a different kind of weight, and you start to understand why when you trace the whole arc backward. The 8-year-old with her first sponsorship deal, the teenager training overseas away from everything familiar, the unranked wild card who beat two of the best players alive in the same week, the young woman who came home to a bank lobby full of executives who'd known her family for 30 years and treated her achievements like their own, all of it converging on a single moment, her name printed with a seed number next to it on the most famous draw sheet in tennis. And now here she is in the summer of 2026, back at Wimbledon for the second time, no longer the wide-eyed debutante who had to qualify her way into relevance, but a seeded player with a target on her back and a country watching every single point, opening her campaign against a familiar opponent from her past. A Mexican player who'd actually beaten her once before on the lower tours, the kind of rematch that adds its own layer of tension before a single ball is even struck, and whatever happens in the matches ahead, win or lose, there's something already worth sitting with in how this story has unfolded. Because so much of modern sports marketing is built on companies chasing whoever is hot at the moment, signing athletes the instant they break through and dropping them the instant they cool off. But what BPI did was almost the opposite. They signed a teenager who hadn't proven anything yet on the professional tour, based on nothing more than potential and a personal connection that predated her entire career, and they stuck with her through years where the headlines weren't guaranteed, through ITF tournaments in cities most people couldn't find on a map. And that kind of patience is rare enough in sports that when it finally pays off the way it has for Alex Eala, it stops being a marketing story and starts being something closer to a genuine relationship, one built on a coincidence 3 decades old, two parents meeting at a bank long before they had a daughter who would one day make that bank's name trend across an entire nation every time she stepped onto a grass court in London. And maybe that's the real lesson sitting underneath all the rankings and the records and the milestones, that the biggest breakthroughs rarely happen overnight no matter how sudden they look from the outside. They're built quietly, year after year, by people who believed in something long before the rest of the world had any reason to. And for one tennis player from Quezon City and one bank that happened to be part of her story before she was even born, that belief is finally being rewarded in front of the entire world.